Chapter 8 covers fungi, and I'm also adding the helminths, which are a group of worms from the animal kingdom. So first of all, we'll study fungi. You can pronounce it fungi, fungi. I've heard it pronounced both ways. This includes yeast, molds, and mushrooms. And molds and mushrooms are multicellular, while yeasts are single-celled. And so they do seem kind of drastically different, but they have a lot of things in common as well, one of which is chitin in their cell wall. This is just kind of a drawing. You may remember Robert Hooke. He was kind of the first discoverer of the cork cells, and so he looked at mold that he saw growing. If we look at it up close, then we'll notice that it has these stalks to it with these organisms on the end, or these structures on the end. You may kind of see it if you see mold growing on your food. It's kind of a fuzzy appearance, but it's really these thread-like hyphae that make up a mycelium, and that's what gives it its appearance. But these structures up here are meant to hold spores, and those spores will then be released for reproduction. So as far as structure, growth, and reproduction goes, when we're looking at fungi, we are dealing with eukaryotic cells. And fungi, except for the yeast, are composed of hyphae. And like I said, hyphae are these kind of thread-like filaments. When there are a lot of them, then we call it mycelium. So really those two terms are kind of related. What this does, it's kind of like little roots. It's not like roots for plants, but just a little bit different. It allows them to actually grow kind of into the ground, or allows them to kind of spread out, and that way they can have contact with water and food supply and take that to the cells, because these cells are going to need to eat. Also in the fungi kingdom, the cell walls contain chitin, and chitin is a strong substance that has a chalky, kind of flaky texture to it. Not chalky, just flaky, I guess. If you think of like a crawfish exoskeleton, it would be kind of like that, and that's what's also made up of chitin. This group, they are heterotrophs, and so this means that they have to digest their food in order to eat it, and also besides eating it, they perform a lot of tasks that are important to the environment as far as decomposing certain organic matters also, and that helps us generate all of our cycles of a lot of the different elements and nutrients that we need in nature. And so some of these also produce cellulase. Cellulase is an enzyme that helps different organisms break down cellulose. And so cellulose, you can kind of think of it as fiber. It's made up of a bunch of glucose molecules. Glucose is sugar, and that's what our cells need. All cells are going to need glucose in order to gain some energy. But cellulose is hard to break down. We as humans cannot digest cellulose on our own, but we also have bacteria growing in our gut to help us break down cellulose. Now this isn't bacteria because this is a fungus, but they have that function too as well. Fungus in general can grow in more acidic environments, so at a lower pH, whereas maybe bacteria can't grow at kind of an acidic pH, fungi is more likely to do so. Also a hypertonic environment, what that means is if we have let's say that we're trying to preserve food, and so a lot of canned goods have high salt content to them. That's a hypertonic environment. So if there is something living in there, the living organisms will try to balance out the salt content from the outside of the cell compared to the in. And when they try to do that, the cells, it will actually kill the cells. So that's used as a common preserving method as well. And so as far as surviving that, fungi can survive that a little bit better than bacteria. This just shows an image of yeast surrounded by some bacterial cells, and the larger cells there are the yeast, and so this would be a yeast cell, this is a yeast cell, this is a yeast cell that's actually budding, and so this growing new yeast cells from here. This is a form of asexual reproduction. You can kind of see how much bigger that the yeast cells are compared to bacteria. And remember, bacteria are prokaryotes, yeast would be eukaryotes. This over here is showing some hyphae, and so hyphae are those kind of filament-like threads that we looked at, or that we talked about as far as the fungus growing, kind of like its tiny little roots, although technically not roots. As far as reproduction goes, this will be kind of a common theme with a lot of different organisms that we talk about, but they have asexual methods and sexual methods. And basically asexual means that you have one organism that has a certain set of DNA, and that DNA is going to get copied exactly and passed on exactly as is. If it's a sexual method, then there has to be a formation of something called gametes, and those gametes contain half of the DNA or half of the chromosomes in a cell, so that when those gametes combine, one gamete combines with another, then they come together and they form the full set of DNA, or the full amount of chromosomes as well. In humans, you can think, in other organisms, you can think of egg and sperm, so it's kind of similar to that as well, as far as those containing half of the amount of DNA. So the process of sporulation is just spore formation. Again, you can have asexual spores or you can have sexual spores. And so in the asexual case, the spores are genetically identical. And again, they contain all of the DNA or all of the chromosomes that a species will have. And so how they actually spread those spores kind of depends on the different types of organisms that we're talking about. And so there's really a lot of different type of containers for these spores. This picture here is called conidia. And so this would be called a conidiophore, and that's what contains all the spores, and the spores are what we call conidia. So when the wind blows, when animals come by and kind of knock at them and whatnot, these spores get spread, and then they can develop into new fungi as well. This down here is a picture of yeast again, and the yeast cells are actually reproducing another form of asexual reproduction by budding, where literally you get kind of these offshoots of the cell, and then eventually they pinch off. And where you can see these kind of round structures here, those are called bud scars. So something just pinched off of that fairly recently as well. With sexual reproduction, it's a little more complicated. Again, there still can be spores involved. It's just that these spores would be considered to be gametes, or maybe sexual spores, because their chromosome number has been cut in half. So their genetic material has been cut in half, so that when it forms with another gamete, that half plus 1/2 will equal a whole. In humans, we would talk about this as meiosis, cutting down that number in half, and then during fertilization of egg and sperm, the number would go back to its normal set in that case as well. And so we can see this in other organisms too, not necessarily with egg and sperm, but again with sort of what we might call positive and negative spores. And so if you do have these sexual spores, a positive is going to be attracted to a negative, and then when they join together, they'll combine their DNA. These are also spread by wind and water, so spores can spread the same way no matter if it's asexual or sexual. But as far as the genetic composition, there's more diversity. You know, if we were all just clones of each other and we all multiplied and, you know, every human formed the exact same human, that wouldn't be very diverse. But because of the way that we have meiosis in humans and those chromosomes come together differently, there's diversity. So this is the same when it comes to organisms in the fungi kingdom. This is just an example of a life cycle of a mushroom. This is going to fall into a certain phylum that we'll look at in a little bit. And so you can see kind of at the top, we have the mushroom, typical mushroom that you're used to seeing. And so we have, under the mushroom cap here, we have what are called gills. And the gills are where the spores are kind of hidden. And so they're kind of captured underneath there. And if something comes along and bumps this, maybe those spores get distributed. But they're also growing in this process as well. And so in this case, this spore has two different types of cells in here, two different types of nuclei, which is kind of interesting, and it forms these basidiospores. The basidiospores mature. The basidiospores, these are the positive and negative types. They form these mating types, and then when they come together, then they form this hyphae. So the hyphae is a bunch of these cells put together, and then it grows more and more cells and grows into this mycelium structure as well. In the type of mushrooms, you would see kind of this typical mushroom cap that you're used to, but not all fungi form mushrooms, just this certain group that we'll look at. So speaking of groups, as far as classification of fungi, there are a lot of different groups, what we would call phyla. If you remember classification, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It's just a way to put things into groups. So we look at certain phyla of the kingdom fungi, and the 4 to 5 that we're going to look at here are listed. And so they have their scientific names. We're just going to look at some kind of classic examples. But that does not mean that these are the only examples that exist. So the first group, the Chytridiomycota, these are also known as chytrids. These are aquatic mostly, which means that they are found in water, and so that could be different types of water. But this is kind of the oldest known group as far as evolution goes. And kind of one of the big factors here is that their zoospores have flagella. Because they're in water, flagella is going to help them move around and help those spores get disseminated, because that's kind of the goal, is to spread those spores to keep the species going. There's kind of an interesting section you can look at in your textbook. There's actually a type in this group that is infecting, they think, about 1/3 of the world's amphibian species and kind of killing off a lot of the frogs that are in the world today. Because amphibians have very thin skin, sometimes they're affected by things in the environment most easily. So read that section. It's kind of interesting to look at and look for an example of a specific species from this group. The next phyla, the Zygomycota, only about 1% of all fungal species, but this is a major group. These are terrestrial, which means that they grow on land. They still typically need a little bit of moisture, although they can, live in some dry conditions as well. This is what you are likely to find on fruit that gets moldy. And so when you have moldy fruit, you might get upset because you can't eat it. But think about the organism that's living on it and eating it instead of you. So if you have an apple that's spoiled, that mold that you might see is actually breaking down those nutrients and absorbing them because it needs to eat too in order to survive. When it comes to sexual reproduction, we have what we call the zoospore. And so that then develops into a fruiting body, and that actually forms sexual spores. There also can be asexual spores, and those are released from the mycelium. And so most organisms make both types of spores, and again, it depends on what their chromosome or their DNA content is as to whether they are sexual spores or asexual spores. Again, the wind can disperse these, just like we've seen some others. So there are some examples in here that are used to make certain products, sometimes through the process of fermentation. In the case of sake, which is an alcoholic drink, Tempe is a product that is used, and that's kind of a product of some of the life cycle of these groups in this Zygomycota. Some also cause disease, so that can be very important to look at as well. The next group is the largest phylum, the Ascomycota. Ascus means sac. So as far as where these spores are contained, they're kind of contained in some sort of sac. And there's a picture here on the right showing those sacs. But they all look different. There's a lot of examples in here, and they just have really some special neat shapes and whatnot. Most organisms in this group are decomposers, meaning they break down dead organisms that are going to help to kind of feed the nutrient cycle in an ecosystem. Some of them actually go on plants, and they harm plants and take over plants and act as parasites. Most of these are multicellular. There are some that are single-celled, but if they're multicellular, then you're going to see the hyphae and the mycelium as well. Again, something like a yeast is single-celled that we talked about before a little bit as well. But most of these in this group are single-celled, and they're going to be pretty big because we can actually see them. And so they have sexual stages and asexual stages as well. And so again, kind of the same concept here. In this group, as far as how they form in the fruiting body, each fruiting body has 8 ascospores. So it's kind of interesting that there's always 8 in this case as well. And so if you look here, here's an example of the fruiting body. This is just kind of a slice taken, stained with a special cell. And so in here are where we have the ascospores, and you can count 8 in each of these containers here as well. And so their goal is to be spread in order to combine with other cells and to recombine through fertilization and then form a new organism. So some examples from here. You should read about some of these examples and go through them. You maybe have heard of some of these, but make sure that you look at your textbook as well and read a little bit more about these, and then just have an idea of some examples that fall into this group here as well. Something like Aspergillus can be carcinogenic and can cause disease, can cause harm, but other times different species actually act as a preservative and is used to produce citric acid. So you just kind of never know. It depends on the specific types. But this is the genus, the Aspergillus, listed here. The next group, the Basidiomycota, these are kind of what you're used to seeing, mushrooms with gills. Some can be very poisonous. There's an article you can read in your textbook about this as well. But this includes things like a typical mushroom you would see, puffballs. Maybe you've come across those before and kicked into them and spread the spores everywhere. They're shelf fungi. They kind of grow off of a tree and look like a little shelf. Rusts and smuts, and there's an example of a rust at the top picture there and a smut growing on corn as well. And that can destroy crops, and so it's important to kind of be able to control those as well. And then of course some mushrooms we eat because they taste good. And so the mycelium, we're not actually seeing it, but it forms underground, and the mushroom actually comes up, and that's what I mentioned before, holds the spores underneath here. So the mycelium would be in the ground absorbing those nutrients. The last kind of group here is just called the imperfect fungi, and these aren't really, it's not a lot necessarily known about any sort of sexual life cycle, and they don't fit very well into another group, but they are definitely very common because you probably have heard of athlete's foot before, and so there are several examples that fall into this group that can cause kind of human discomfort and human disease as well. So that's just kind of a look at the classification of some of the different groups. Again, it's not all of them, but it's certainly some of the most important ones that stand out.